Okay, PTTers, I am back with some more bonus content. This video is going to be a little longer than the other ones. I try to keep them pretty short, but this one's going to be a little longer because there's a lot of information that I want to talk about here. And what I want to talk about for this video is career tracks. So hopefully you've gone through the first few pieces of content and you've done a self-assessment. You understand what you want out of this process and what you're able to do. You also understand what a diplomat is, kind of generally speaking. But I want to go into, with this video, more detail about the career tracks, which are, some of the job categories that you can do as either a foreign service officer or a foreign service specialist. Now, there are 5 career tracks that I'm going to talk about today. There's the counselor officer, the economic officer, management officer, as well as political officer. And then the last one is the public diplomacy officer. Now, I did list these out in the book with some definitions and synopsis about what they are, but I want to spend some time just kind of digging a little bit deeper into what these are, to also give you kind of my informal perspective. The way I wrote that book, the book was very formal in nature, and I wrote it that way. And I wrote it in a formal manner because that's kind of how the Foreign Service is. It's a very kind of formal culture, and I wrote that book with a kind of formal lean to it to kind of fit in with what the culture is. But as you can tell by now in my videos, I try to be a lot less formal, a lot more relaxed, and just kind of conversational when I'm talking about this stuff. And so that's the approach I want to take with these different job roles, or career tracks rather. So starting with the first one, the counselor officer. The counselor officer, again, these are job tracks, right? And so within the tracks, there are many, many different jobs, right? And so I go into this in more detail in my longer trainings, but just understand that think about tracks as categories. And within those categories, there are various subcategories. So, these are not job titles, they are career tracks, and there are many, many different jobs within each career track. But each career track has a general focus that is, kind of consistent across all the different jobs within that track. All right, so counselor officer. The counselor officer, these are people who work at the embassies or consular offices. And a lot of times they're dealing with visas and passports and, making sure that stuff is all taken care of. So if there's a consular officer overseas working in a consular office, and say a tourist, let's just say this is in Italy, right? And so say someone is vacationing in Italy and somehow they lost their passport, or they have problems with their visa, or something is wrong with their paperwork basically that allows them to be in that country. The consular officer will help them work through those problems and get those situations taken care of, right? So that's really what they're there for. They're there to support in those types of situations. They issue visas, and things of that nature. They also work with local citizens of different countries. If these local citizens of different countries are trying to get to the U.S., maybe they're trying to immigrate to the U.S. for work or something, or maybe they're trying to go to the U.S. seeking asylum and things of that nature. So the consular officer deals with those types of situations. They also deal with, God forbid, if somehow, for some reason, Americans need to be evacuated from a country, they help with things along those nature. I'm sorry, things along those lines, um, as well, even down to human trafficking. So it's a lot within that job track, just like all the others, and there are a lot of different particular jobs that could be fulfilled within those job tracks. So that's the first one, counselor officer. The next one is a economic officer. The economic officer is really charged with working with the host country, really to try to further the interests of U.S. businesses and U.S. industries, right? So, they'll work with local business people, they'll work with local industry leaders, local industry organizations, and they work to negotiate, favorable terms to generate business for U.S. companies, for U.S. industries within those local countries. So at a very high level, that's what an economic officer does. They also help just manage the relationships and the ties between the host country and the United States. And they have to be very, very skillful negotiators, because that's paramount within the economic realm of activities between host countries and the United States. And these economic officers, they may work with government officials, they may work with business officials, industry leaders, again, like I said, to help address a lot of these needs and get their objectives and goals met. They also can, and when you think about the economic officer, you talk a lot about kind of the local country, but, they can be working with that local country in an effort to do something on a more global scale. When you think about, say, like the transatlantic trade agreement, right? A lot of different countries were involved in that agreement, and negotiations had to take place with different countries separately, and it just kind of rolled up to the larger agreement. So this economic officer could be working on things that only affect that local host country, but they can also be working on things that could have a worldwide range and impact. So that's a very, very, very cool track, especially if you're into business type things. All right, so the next track is a management officer. The management officer, these are, I call these the people leaders. These are the people who are back in the embassies, back in the offices and the consular officers, and they're really leading the staff in those environments. They're managing the staff in those environments, right? They're making sure that the local staff and the U.S. staff are handling their responsibilities in terms of whatever their job responsibilities are. They're making sure that stuff is happening. They're making sure that processes and procedures are in place. They're making sure that all that stuff is taken care of. And the range of expertise of these management officers could vary a lot, right? They can go from human resource leaders, right? You have to have people within human resources because you have to hire people. Sometimes you have to let people go. People have benefit questions, they have pay questions. There are performance review processes that have to be created and adhered to and changed and updated as needed. And so every embassy, every consulate needs HR, right? You can't have people working without HR. So HR is part of the management officer job track. And then this goes back to what I said about different jobs within the job track. So management officer is a job track, but I just talked about human resources. So there's a whole slew of jobs within human resources under this management officer job track. Finance. Finance is another big thing. You always have to have somebody watching the finances, right? Because you're always spending money or bringing in money, and you have to have someone watching over that, right? How we spend money, how we invoice, how we make sure people pay us when we get invoiced, how we make sure we are paying on time when people invoice us, right? So that's all within the finance realm. So you can have a management officer that's working in this finance realm, doing accounting, doing bookkeeping, doing all that kind of stuff. Again, process and procedures around these things, and again, managing the people around these things. A lot of embassies have, at least some of the larger ones, that have small, I'm going to say banks, for lack of a better term, but they have small banks within them, right? And these banks have cashiers, right? Those cashiers have supervisors, right? And these management officers within the finance realm are normally the supervisors of these cashiers. And they normally manage how these cashiers work, the process and procedures that these cashiers follow, and they manage these cashiers, right? So that's one area, one functional area within the management officer job track. Um, Other areas. What other areas? So IT, right? I'm a software engineer by trade, and I left my job as a IT executive to come here. So IT is my realm of expertise. So I'm under the management officer umbrella, but my focus is IT. That's the background that I bring, right? And let me clarify something, right? Because I'm talking about the management officer track right now, and I'm talking about the different functional areas within those management officer tracks. Where I work, where a person works within those tracks, or how they move around across those tracks, depends on whether they're a foreign service officer or a foreign service specialist. The main difference between a foreign service officer and a foreign service specialist is that a foreign service officer can skip around across all these different tracks, right? They're more of a generalist. They can move around. They can have one post where they're doing a lot of counselor officer type stuff. They can have a different post where they're doing a lot of management officer type stuff. And then they can have another post where they're doing economic officer type stuff, right? So foreign service officer is more of a generalist that can move around and bounce around different tracks. A foreign service specialist, as the name implies, is a specialist. They tend to stay within their area of expertise. So I'll use my wife as an example. I'm talking about my wife a lot, right, in these videos. But I talk about her because we're here because of her. This is always a dream of hers, and so we're here because of her, right? So that's why I talk about that a lot. So she's in the management. She's a financial management specialist, right? So she's a specialist, and her area of specialty is finance. So she works in the finance area, and that's where she stays, right? Because she's a specialist. She doesn't bounce around from counselor type stuff to economic type stuff to political type stuff. She's a specialist, so she stays in the finance area because that's her specialty. And so she came in as a specialist, and that's where she stays. Um, so, so myself applying as a management officer, right? I can bounce around between the different tracks because I'm more of a generalist than a specialist. Now, I have a very broad and deep IT background, so I could have easily came in as a information officer specialist, which is basically specializing in the IT area and just stay in the IT area. But I chose to be more of a generalist because I get bored easy and I like doing different stuff. And so I like being able to bounce around, right? So I just want to kind of talk about that difference because a lot of times people can get confused by that. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on talking about those differences between an officer, a foreign service officer, and a foreign service specialist. They're both foreign service employees. They're both diplomats. They both have same pay, similar pay grades, same benefits, same perks, all that stuff. They're the same. The only difference is one is a specialist, and one is a generalist. That is the only difference. So, management officer track. The next particular track I want to talk about is the political officer. The political officer is the political officer is the person. The political officer is the nosy neighbor, right? Political officer is like the neighbor that sits on the front porch and just knows what's going on in the neighborhood. They see everything, they hear everything, and they may even gossip about everything, right? And they know everything that's going on in the neighborhood, and they can tell you what's going on in the neighborhood so you can act accordingly. That's what the political officer does for the United States, right? For high-ranking officials that have to negotiate and talk with high-ranking leaders about what's going on within that country. The political officer is the person that provides this information so that the high-ranking diplomats can make decisions that they need to make and negotiate whatever they need to negotiate, right? That's what the political officer does. To be honest, I don't think anything would really be able to work well from a diplomatic perspective in terms of, you know, very important high-ranking things without political officers. They provide all the juicy information that's used to make decisions and do diplomatic work, right? That's a cool job. Cool job. Or cool track, rather. The next track is the public diplomacy officer. Now, remember in the last video, if you saw it, I talked about what a diplomat is, and I talked about how the term diplomat kind of conjures up a certain picture of people, right, from TVs and movies, right? We talked about that in our last video. If you didn't see the last video, go back and watch it. But basically, the public diplomacy officer, these are those people, right? These are the people that comes to your mind when you think about diplomat. These are the folks that's always suited up, always, dressed up business-wise. They're the ones that's doing all the networking. They're doing all the smoozing. They're going to all the parties. They're going to all the lunches. They're going to all the dinners. They're going to all the different events, and they're rubbing elbows with all the big wigs of that local country, right? And they're doing this to kind of push the U.S. interest, to further the U.S. interest. They're doing this to try to influence the host countries, to make sure the host countries are perceiving the U.S. the way the U.S. wants those countries to perceive us. They're promoting, making sure that that those host countries understand what we need them to understand, and that they're supporting U.S. policies and goals. These are some of the things that the public diplomacy officers do, right? They're the ones that you see on TV. They're the ones that you see in the news. They're the ones that you see in newspaper and magazine articles, right? These people are really the face of diplomacy. That's what those people are. And behind the face of diplomacy, right? Behind these public diplomacy officers are literally thousands of people working behind the scenes to keep stuff running, right? And that's no exaggeration. Thousands of people behind the scenes, thousands of diplomats, because all these people, working in the Foreign Service as either Foreign Service officers or Foreign Service specialists, they're all diplomats, right? So all these other diplomats working behind the scenes to enable these public diplomacy officers to do their work, right? So that's that. Now, those are the 5 tracks. I listed them in the book. I think I'm going to provide a little more detail at the bottom of this video. There should be a link down below that you can get to this if I decide to do it. I haven't done it yet. I probably will do it, but if I do it, it will be in the link right below this video. But these are the 5 tracks. And so when you're coming into the Foreign Service, you need to decide which one of these tracks you want to be in. Now, do not take that decision lightly, because once you decide it, you can't change it. You can't change it until the hiring process is over. Either you got hired or you didn't get hired, right? If you didn't get hired, if for whatever reason you didn't make it through the end of the process, you have the opportunity to start the process over again. And when you start the process over, you can change tracks, but you cannot change the track once you start the process. So it's very important that you understand what track you want to be in, because that decision cannot be changed while you're in that process. Now, let's say you decided on a track, you got hired, and now you're in. Can you change your track then? The answer is yes, but you have to do at least one post within your track before you change it. So you can change it, but you can change it after you get hired, but it's going to take a little bit of time. So very important stuff here, stuff to think about. All of this is important stuff, and all this is stuff to think about, right? Because you're about to flip your lifestyle on its head, right? And so it needs to be done in a very, very thoughtful manner. Take your time, think through it, talk to people, talk to your family. You can always reach out to me with questions that you may have, but this stuff takes thought before you make these decisions. And so I guess that's it for today. And so I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.